Archibald!
Hello, Legionaries. This is General Lance, joined with you, Sergeant Barnes, and Peter Wrangel again. Welcome, sir.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for coming back to the command post, sitting here with some Jack Daniels. But, the news cycle and I guess the international geopolitical situation is a lot more unstable than it ever has been in the last, let's say, 5 years, I would say. And I think really one of the most interesting developments which has happened in the last week is the ostensible withdrawal of all troops from Syria and Iraq. And if you're someone such as myself, our presence in that area has been a long-standing facet of our Middle Eastern deployment schema for a very long time. And I guess I just really wanted to ask you, why is this happening now? And why is it that we're there in the first place? I think a lot of legionaries out there don't know that.
Mm-hmm. Well, to answer the second part about why we're there would probably take several hours. Going back all the way to the the FDR Saudi alliance of during World War II, right? So, but fast forward 100 years or so, the interventions into Syria, the actions against ISIS, are all coordinated and authorized under the authorization of the use of military force that was passed 7 days after 9/11, right? So, because there was no geographic listing, there was no geographic boundaries placed into the piece of legislation. It has been widely interpreted to allow U.S. forces or the DoD administrations to go after terrorists that have never had any type of association with the attacks of 9/11 or attacks directly against U.S. forces, and using that 2001 authorization, they went into Syria, somewhat under the guise of protecting Syrians from the Bashar regime, and also against other types of insurgent organizations, specifically ISIS. And then we can go down a rabbit hole with that whole situation about ISIS and Syria and who funded who and such. But
right.
That's why I guess you can say officially that's why they're in Syria / northern Iraq is the continual fight against ISIS.
So that's
there's a lot of layers to that. There's a lot of truths and half truths and such, but that's why they're saying they're there. And also the oil, right? Don't forget about the oil.
And the interesting thing for someone that's autistically fixated on the Syrian conflict since it broke out in 2011, I think a lot of the listeners out there, I think they're not really cognizant of the dynamics there in Syria, which is basically a three-way local regional arena of contest.
It's a civil war.
Yeah, of course, but it has many different different coalitions vying against each other. You have the Turks and you have the traditional states. You have, of course, American aligned factions, in addition to, of course, the Russian-aligned factions and so on,
Yep.
and the YPG and all that. However, I guess the most salient point that I wanted to ask is, with the invasion of 2003 and the dissolution of the Ba'athist regime, and the follow-on, republic, the Shiite republic in Iraq. Do you believe that, strategically speaking, how do you say this in a polite way? Do you think that the strategic withdrawal is a product of our own loss at that war and our misgivings in consideration to the fact that we invaded Iraq only to turn it over to Iranian influence? Is that valid? A valid perception of how things go?
As simple as I can put it is, the day that the Bush administration gave CENTCOM the authorization to invade Iraq, and then the day that coalition forces crossed the line into Iraq is the day that essentially we handed Iran a proxy nation of Iraq. Granted, it took a decade plus of it of insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, different types of military operations, but that is the outcome. Iran now has a land bridge from its border to Israel, to Lebanon, and so essentially to the Mediterranean because of the miscalculations of going into Iraq. Yes.
Okay, I guess the follow-on question, which is what was in the news cycle specifically, has to do with the ongoing strikes, which caused the deaths of 3 soldiers.
Yes.
And rest in peace, obviously. My heart goes out for them. However, it begs the question, basically the turn of events has been a score of days where UAVs and UAS drone strikes have been striking these forward operating bases of the United States in this territory. And then, of course, we reacted by, let's say, killing leadership of Shiite militias, which are part of the Iraqi defense state, but are considered to be proxies of Iran. I would like you to just go into the specifics on how exactly the Iraqi military has been reconstituted after we kind of dissolved the Ba'athist Party, because from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that I just read this from an article that basically the Badr brigades and a number of other different militias with their political parties became basically ushered in or grandfathered in into almost a feudal type arrangement with the Central Republic government. Is that accurate, or has that changed? What's your
you're correct. So all the different militias, so insurgentist groups that kind of became militias, in the vein of what occurred in during after the troubles in Ireland, between Ireland and UK, they were put into the political system under an umbrella that has a certain term. I cannot think of it at this very moment, but yes. So those militia groups were put into almost, you could say, constituting a national guard that we have here in the States.
Interesting.
To give them somewhat to give them some sort of validity, to give them a feeling that they are part of the system and so forth.
So they do have an official mandate, right? Like, just to be clear, they have an official recognition, recognized relationship with the government.
By they, what do you mean? Like, So these Iranian-aligned militias that are of Shia origin operate under the umbrella of a vast majority of other militias that the Iraqi government kind of recognized, again, in order to, in their thought process, would kind of kind of not mitigate, but kind of give them some sort of control over those militias.
So it sounds like a buy-in system that basically, if they have a stake in the government, that there is
Yes.
obviously this passive influence we could probably
Mm-hmm.
eke out of them. It seems like that's kind of reversed on us though, because I'm just thinking, for instance, of Soleimani and the Quds
Yes.
force
Mm-hmm.
and so on. I guess I wanted your professional opinion as far as the capability of the Quds force or the larger, the larger formation of the IRGC. Are they efficacious? Are they effective? Because partly within myself, and maybe this is my ignorance speaking, it doesn't seem to me that Iran is that necessarily, how do you say this professionally? Let's say they're not really on par with any kind of near peer adversaries at best. And from my readings,
you mean their near peer, or our near peer?
our near peer.
Okay.
And
Okay.
it seems to me, because I read about the Iran-Iraq war recently,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a pretty barely mediocre combat record. And I kind of just wanted to pick your brain as far as, how effective is this force? What is the larger capability of the IRGC? And is this something really we should, as Americans, be concerned about, in the sense that are they a threat significant enough to constitute something being warranted, for further intervention?
So are you familiar with a book called Armies of Sand?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure, like, if I remember correctly, the premise is that the Middle East historically has had systemic issues when it came to fielding Western technology, and then utilizing Western doctrine to fight wars, right? And that's true. That's true from all the way from Iran to northern Africa. Everything that happened during all the three major wars of Israel and its surrounding neighbors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of prove that point that you could get, and also the 91 Gulf War and the 2003 invasion, is that they could have the most advanced technology from the Soviet Union and so forth. They could have trainers to give them on the spot training for doctrine, but again, it's fielded by Middle Easterners, a culture that is very different, that didn't create those things in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm. So there's a mismatch, right?
There's a mismatch, right?
Yeah.
And so, Iran and other nations don't necessarily have to be a near peer threat to be a threat, correct?
Correct.
So, I think what people in the West get stuck on is they just kind of look at capabilities of a country purely based off of how many tanks they have, how many airframes they have, how many ship going, what their fleet looks like, and they just kind of look at a numbers game versus, because in a way that's what we do in the West, right?
Yeah,
we kind of look at what they have on hand, and if ours is better than theirs, right?
Right. Isn't this called force composition? What's the official term for this? Force comparison or something like that?
Yeah, force comparison. It depending on what branch you're on, what branch you're in, and all that, and there's a specific term in intelligence doctrine as well. Mm-hmm. But what has been lost in specifically after the Cold War is that because of the success, quote unquote, of the West, NATO, and the United States during the Cold War, they have come to believe that there is but one way, the only way, to conduct warfare, and that is their way, right? Mm-hmm. And that any other way is going to be inefficient, is going to be overwhelmed by our our ability to concentrate mass at the critical points, our logistics and such.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really give any type of credence to other ways of warfare, other doctrines, other ways of how certain pieces of equipment, certain pieces of technology can be used to hurt friendly forces. And that has really hamstrung a lot of our military might in the last, during, look at GY, right? And they still don't and going in the Pentagon, it seems DOD doesn't really seem to have really listened to any of their, after action reviews and really read any of the products coming out of the centers of lesson learned out of there in Fort Worth, Kansas.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess basically to surmise what you said is basically, just because they are not a conventionally understood force, or that we don't compare to, well, excuse me, from our paradigm, we outstrip them in every measure. However, you're saying that we shouldn't be considering it from our paradigm, and we should be considering it from an absolute perspective, dynamic one, and feel that reach. From my understanding, I've heard some crazy stuff. Like, for instance, there are some Hezbollah bases with a large presence in Venezuela in the Americas, which is an extension of the IRGC. If I'm wrong or correct.
You were not incorrect.
All right, perfect. And so I guess my question to you is, as an asymmetrical threat to the United States, like, I mean, to the homeland, I'm not talking about interests. I'm not talking about the threats posed to our service members, which of course I care about. But as far as, the base standard foundation of homeland security, what is the real threat profile of the IRGC, and what is the Quds force specifically?
As in their ability to their ability to conduct attacks here in the States. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, like the sabotage, or maybe even assassination, smuggling, whatever it is that might undermine, U.S. homeland security.
So I've because of my background, I'm an intelligence officer. I've been the last 20 years, and the biggest question mark and puzzle that I have not been able to unravel is why during the height of the GUI, right? Like going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq, you have Libya, you have all these situations, right? And you have all of these new and arising TTPs that killed a lot of American or coalition soldiers. Why did we never see any of those here in the States, right? In a very permissive, like very open environment, right? Why did we never see them here? I mean, I do not believe that, it's I do not see, DHS, immigration, and all that kind of stuff as some sort of like, all seeing eye and being able to catch all these threats, right?
Right.
So, why didn't we ever see EFPs going off, in and around DC or New York City, or LA? And, why didn't we see, cells of groups going into crowded malls during Christmas and so forth, right? That's something I kind of wonder about and struggle, because it seems like an obvious, tactic or TTP that if you are a, non-traditional or asymmetric threat, that's a route that you would go down, right? Right. So I'm kind of asking you that, like, so, in your opinion, why didn't we see that?
To be frank with you, and this is something that I've been harping on for a long time, and in my experience, with talking with American military men specifically, I think we really abandoned the political formulations, the equation, or the reasoning, if that makes sense, behind kinetic operations. And I think that if Iran were to do something as, I don't know, as flagrant as Al Qaeda did in September 11th, 2001,
Mm-hmm.
ultimately it would be defeating its own strategic long-term goals, right? I mean,
Okay.
ultimately,
Okay. Yeah.
Iran is not Al Qaeda. At the end of the day, Iran is
Mhm.
a nation state with the
Yep.
interest of providing security and economic prosperity to its citizens, at the very least. And ultimately, I don't believe it has the same calculus of politics in comparison to non-state actors, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I guess the reason why I ask you though is because I'm sure you saw that Biden just made a proclamation regarding Palestine and the
Mm-hmm.
populations trying to leave Palestine, and of
Mm-hmm.
course the corollary implied topic of Hamas, right? And so I guess
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, how related is Hamas to Iran? Because it seems like the news is trying to connect these two, even though, of
Mm-hmm.
course, Hamas is actually a Sunni Islamist group, from what I understand,
Mm-hmm.
and that Hezbollah and all Iranian forces are Shiites. And of course, this is a
Correct.
chasm between these two. I mean, it's a very serious religious division. And so I guess I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to ask you, what is the role there that they're playing, and do you believe that, I guess give us some background as far as what Biden's talking about and what the implications of that are.
So to kind of go back to the last point, about why do you didn't see these type of things arise in here in the states, like and this is before before Iran and stuff, like when Al Qaeda and ISIS were really the threat, right? Like it's in my opinion, and it's that idiom of like you don't shit where you eat, right? So you're not going to go um, into the home nation of your enemy, for the most part, when you're asymmetric and cause all this havoc, because what you're going to do is you're going to turn again, a war that was, GWAT was a back burner war, right?
Mm-hmm.
It didn't require a war economy. Bush was talking about going out there and spending money, and it never really was a war that the American people kind of had felt they needed to tighten their belts for, right? So
Mm-hmm.
why turn it into a war of such? And so in a way, that's why, and I think you didn't see such things happening here in the States. And then to your point about why you don't see Iran and Iranian backed proxies doing that here in the States is, again, you're right. They are a nation state, and nation states have different interests than, say, um, non-aligned organizations throughout the world. So, yeah, they're not going to, they're not going to set off necessarily a nuke in Kansas City because they know that what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, so it's not the sum of all
Yeah,
fears. It's not Tom Clancy. That's what you're telling me.
yeah. Yeah.
Well, okay. So, I mean, in
And so
regard,
and so then going into the Palestine issue, can you ask the question again?
yeah. So I'm getting this from normie newspaper sites, and obviously, let's take that with a heavy whole bag of
Yeah.
salt, right? So I guess my
Mm-hmm.
question to you is: parse reality from fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and explain to us the relationship between Hamas and Iran, and what
Mm-hmm.
is that the dynamic between, like the significance of Biden's pronouncement about the Palestinian people in Gaza.
So, to be completely honest, I do not know the in-depth history between Hamas and Iran. I do know when Gaza was essentially given governance from Israel. When Israel gave Gaza self-governance, they held elections. Hamas won, and then Hamas just never really held elections since, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they just kind of held on to power through series of fear, intimidation, and projecting the issues that the Palestinian people have onto the Jewish nation, to the Western world, and also to a certain extent other Muslim nations that surround them.
Mm-hmm.
And so Hamas, it's again, Hamas and Iran. So it's a situation of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was documented in Iraq that there was coordination between Sunni and Shia insurgent groups, against coalition forces. But then the moment the mosque got the mosque was bombed in Karbala, is that right? The mosque that was bombed in Iraq that kicked off the sectarian civil war, all bets were off, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's when, Iraq, and that's when Sunnis and Shias were just killing each other left and right. You had Shia death squads just roaming Baghdad, killing everybody, cutting off heads, and all that kind of jazz, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, they in a sense, they have a very long history of not getting along and hating each other. But, when faced with a, somewhat common enemy, they can say, well, okay, well, let's kill them first, and then we can get back to killing each other.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting how parochial like these conflicts are. It's almost like you're opening a book and being transported back to medieval Europe. It just seems like this, a bunch of warlords that from time to time put down their weapons against each other and turn in a common foe. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tactic, and it is a situation as old as time and as old as warfare, where two clans, two organizations that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, and quite frankly hate each other, will band together in order to destroy an external foe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it leads us to my real question here, because I'm sure you've been following the urban operations going on with the IDF going into Gaza, and basically them blowing the entire strip of land into smithereens, clearing out underground tunnels, and there are multiple.
And there's the recent operation, and was it Northern? Like, I'm not gonna lie, like sometimes I just kind of like gloss over a lot of that, because it's just it just becomes so propaganda. There's so much propaganda surrounding it from every angle. It just becomes tiresome. Wow. And so if I'm tracking correctly, there has been, or there is going to be, a rather large operation by the IDF into northern Gaza. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Where essentially like all the refugee, like all the people pushed one way or the other has gone for safety, right?
Right. And for the audience out there, for relevance, just think of, if you can vision in your mind's eye Israel, and then right at the coast in Ascalon, there's this strip of land. It's called Gaza, and it borders directly on Egyptian Sinai, and of course has a large, frontier with Israel. The conflict that we're seeing is unprecedented in the amount of civilian casualties incurred on the Palestinian population. And it seems as though that there's this discord between President Biden and Netanyahu, who is the prime minister, as far as the conduct of the war and the manner in which the war is, I guess, bordering on ethnic cleansing. And it seems that the Egyptians don't want to allow the refugees from Palestine into their territory, and it seems that the Jordanians don't want that either. Nor do any other, possible neighboring states. Can you explain to us what's up with that, and why is it that they don't want to accept them?
Yeah, sorry for my laughter during your talk.
I get it.
It's so the Israeli state was created in 1947 by the was it UN Charter, right? And the United States was the first nation to recognize it. Again, if my memory serves correctly, which comes out of the British Mandate, going back, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War One, and the creation of Israel, it wasn't necessarily like a widely accepted or wanted action in the international sphere, right? The Brits were kind of divided on it. The French, a lot of major players were kind of on the fence about it, and not getting into conspiracies or being called a I am neither anti-Semitic nor am I a Zionist, I guess.
Yeah.
Even though it's hilarious when people call me either one. But yeah, so Israel and the fledgling government, fought a war that at the end they expelled millions of Palestinians from their land, right, which has occurred historically through time. Every nation has done so, right? Accusations of genocide, ethnic cleansing, the right of return, and so forth. These are all things that kind of surround the creation of Israel, right? And not getting into the validity of those is just because those are things that just happen, anytime there is war. Mm. And then, over the course of Israel's, after those years, they fight a series of wars wars against coalitions of Arab nations, and one where they were almost annihilated, pushed into the sea, and others where they were, begged to stop, by Henry Kissinger. They were begged to stop going further into Egypt, right? Mm-hmm. And then after that, a lot of the Arab nations around them kind of realized, hey, maybe this isn't the best approach, and certain governments, started to, work in the shadows with the Israeli government for certain things, and so forth, and a lot of countries started to switch from alliances with the Soviet Union, with military technology and so forth, to the U.S. Egypt being probably the most prominent, mm-hmm. And so. With all that being said, you had large amounts of Palestinians diaspora that were essentially looking for somewhere to go, right? Mm-hmm. But they relatively had a dilemma. So their dilemma is, if they go to a nation and accept their citizenship, then I guess the way things are, they lose any type of claim on their right to return, right? At least that's the way I understand it. And so they are just there. They're relatively stateless wherever they go. So, Egypt, Jordan, and so forth. Lebanon. Well, the problem is when this diaspora has been used as a tool, specifically by the PLO, that was created by Arafat, to kind of to rabble rouse, to use to collect all of this anger and so forth and direct it towards Israel. Mm-hmm. But doing so, they had to use Arab nations as staging points, specifically in this case Jordan and Lebanon. Jordan began to realize that the Palestinian diaspora in their country was essentially a state within a state. The diaspora started to get not only violent towards Israel interests, but also to Jordanian interests. And so the Jordanian military declared war on them, leading to what is called the Black September in 1970, or the Jordanian Civil War, that lasted, I think, about 8 months, and expelled the Palestinians from their nation, realizing that they're troublemakers because of certain reasons. Right. Then you have the situation in Lebanon, right, where the diaspora, being used as a tool by the PLO, began to use it as a staging ground to attack Israel. Lebanon started getting pissed because Lebanon at the time was still it was like the France of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. It was majority Christian before the Palestinian immigration, which is interesting.
I'm not sure about that stat, because I know that they've always had some sort of like government sharing type of situation between the Druids, the Christians, and the Muslims. Mm-hmm. And so when the PLO and the Palestinian diaspora started attacking Christians, the Lebanese military took military action against them, and that was the catalyst for the Lebanese Civil War. So again, they were finally expelled. Mm-hmm. Egypt, people kind of forget this, there's a wall that separates Gaza, or no fence between Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, because again, the Egyptians do not want the Palestinians within their territory.
I wonder why.
Recently, recently they have moved significant amount of military hardware into the Sinai right outside border crossing, saying no, if you push these people into our country, we're going to push back. We're going to push back against what you're doing because we don't want them in our territory. Mm-hmm. And seem to kind of overlook that, right? They seem to overlook that a lot of places where the diaspora goes, it tends to not end well, or it doesn't tend to end in the best situation for the home nation, right? Mm-hmm. And that plays a large part of why, again, right today in 2024, Muslim nations are not opening the doors for the diaspora. Mm-hmm. But it's all, and also, you also have the thing of it keeps a stick in the eye and makes Israel looks bad, right? In a way, if that makes sense.
I mean, of course.
So it's a two-way street, right? Like, hey, we don't want them in our nation because I know what they can do because of their history. But in a way, at the same time, we can use it as a tool to keep a stick in the eye to the Israeli government.
I mean, moreover, it's also not ceding more ground to the Israelis. I mean, which no one wants to see, I guess, in that area among the Arab nations. And just for the record, and I feel like it's important to explicate this for the record, we're examining military issues from a completely third-party, indifferent perspective. I hope you understand this. We're not taking one side or the other. We're just examining it with indifference. And I know that might sound cold, but it's important for people to understand.
Yeah.
Because...
I mean,
Go ahead.
I mean, as a nation state, Israel has a right to exist as a nation state. Okay, that's but you can still criticize the methods and means of which they do in order to preserve that nation state, right? Those are two different things.
Right. And it's interesting because, in information warfare of today, the curious thing is that any kind of, chatter on these on YouTube or whatever social media it may be, is instantly picked up by the the media information SIGINT sources of whatever and operators. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm sure you've experienced that before, and that's definitely one of the most interesting dynamics of fifth generational warfare. I don't know if do you ascribe to that model, by the way, fourth, fifth generation, etc.
Yeah, I mean, as a general framework, I do. Like most frameworks, they're not 100% complete. So, it's good to have kind of, multiple ones, if that makes sense.
Of course. I mean, I personally use it just as a touchstone because it's the most alluded to concept. However, I'm of the personal conviction that I think even things as we consider novel, like, information warfare via the internet, I think they've always had a form of that. It just wasn't as pronounced, and it wasn't the center of gravity of previous iterations of war. But anyway, returning to the original.
Well, and that's mainly because of technology and the internet and so forth.
Of course, yeah, and we see that with every iteration. There's an emphasis on different, mechanization, whatever. And anyway, I guess returning to the original point, I guess the most interesting thing to me is, the innovation in munitions, the cheapening of smart drones and smart munitions and UAS systems, which are extremely accessible. And
also don't forget like the so you speak of smart munitions, so don't forget about the kind of like more kinetic, less explosive type of missile systems that have been used in the in the recent past.
I heard something like that. It was a surgical missile that was designed to target one specific dude in a hospital setting, but because it didn't want a mass casualty event, it was like a missile that deployed at blades that exploded, and it didn't harm anyone else except for the targeted guy in question. It was honestly kind of creepy. However, what I'm trying to ask you is, we're seeing this in Ukraine as well, and we'll talk about that in following conversation. But I wanted to ask you, with the with this new emphasis on mass, cheap, smart munitions, are we going to see the end of capital-intensive, weapon systems like tanks,
Hmm.
freaking IFVs, or what have you? What's your opinion on that?
It's funny, just kind of my, I guess, my not somewhat limited knowledge of what the Army's planning to do and some of the insights into their weapon systems that they are creating. I mean, even the U.S. Army is starting to lean, even with their more capital intensive programs, into making them less capital intensive, and more mobile, and so forth. So even in that sense, they are understanding that message and going along with it. Will it be the end? No. I'm always very wary when people say X is obsolete, Y is obsolete, and so forth, because the moment you start thinking like that, your enemy is going to use that logic and thought process against you in a way. And so it's never really a good idea to say that something's becoming obsolete. It should be more viewed as what is going to be more applicable in the geographic and cultural landscape the war is going to be fought in. If I'm making sense.
Yes, of course.
Right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's circumstantial, and I was actually listening to the United States Army.
But again, but again, so the problem is a country like the United States that spans the globe, they have to kind of be ready to fight everywhere, right? And so
Precisely.
that comes down to prioritization, and then that comes down to pricing, and then what happens if you're wrong? Like you can't. It's nearly impossible to build and maintain a piece of equipment that is applicable to 100% of all terrain in throughout the globe. It just isn't, right.
Yep. And that's the interesting thing too, is that this is a procurement philosophy question that I think is something that besets all major military powers, because you want to be able to actually coalesce and form mass, and so therefore you want to have interchangeability of parts and redundancy, but at the same time, not everything. Sometimes you need let's say a fine chisel instead of a sledgehammer for everything, but you've got a ton of sledgehammers. So what ends up happening is Russia in 1995 in Chechnya rolling in for a counterinsurgency with basically an entire armored corps, and then getting their shit pushed in because they were completely mismatched with the environment and with the nature of the mission. Now, I guess I wanted to give some feedback, or background rather, to the audience listening. There is a number of different modernization programs going on in the United States military, and namely among them is the U.S. Army plan. It's called Army of 2030, but effectively what
and the Army of 2040. So don't forget, those are two things as well.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. There is one follow-on as well, isn't there?
Yep.
So,
yes, there is.
Just focusing on the 2030, however, because of the corollary with the Marine Corps, it seems as though, and from their own lectures that I've been listening to, the refocusing of mass over, of course, the brigade tactical team, combat team model.
You're correct.
And
You're correct.
I wanted to pick your brain as far as how mass comes into play in modern warfare, and do you believe that because how do I frame this in the correct way that I'm trying to get at? But it seems like smart munitions are becoming so plentiful and so cheap that ultimately throwing mass is the only way to overcome surgical munitions, which are, of course, tailored to our Cold War era 1980s airland battle type techniques of Schwerpunkt and so on. What is the way to overcome these smart munitions in modern warfare? Have you discovered any talk about that? Is there any initiative to address this?
So I guess you're speaking of the one of the initiatives of Army 2030 is to take the brigade combat team that has dominated, since 2001, the GOI, right? And strip it of its assets that were once at the division, then to reconstitute them at the division level and make the division, rather than the brigade, the main maneuver force on the battlefield. I'm assuming that's what you're kind of talking about in that regards, right?
I am.
Okay. So, and then how does and then can you ask the question again about mass? Just make sure I'm tracking right.
Yeah, absolutely. Is the reintroduction of mass a counter to the center of gravity posed by smart munitions? So basically making targets plentiful but cheap. Is that?
Yeah.
I know that sounds really dark because it's
well, I mean, no,
lives, but
how do people believe the Allies were successful at Normandy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was literally mass again. It was the hope that the Germans would have less bullets than Allied soldiers that could be put onto the beach, right? Essentially, that's what it was.
Of course.
I mean, kind of, very
broad
kind
strokes.
Very rough and very, Crayola type, logic. But yeah, that's essentially what it was, right? We're just going to throw it at so many people at you that there's just not enough targets for you to hit all at once. So it's not so much a reintroduction of mass; it's more of a, I guess I would say, a refocus on mass. And again, that's being rather pedantic, but mass has always been a part of the principles of war. And so it's the reason I say that is because it's not like they are going to, the army is not getting any bigger. Okay. It's actually shrinking. There has been discussions about, force changes, really, leading to force reductions or changes in force structure, which would lead to force reduction in forces because people just aren't signing up. So the army is going to have a hard time of putting enough mass in one place to overcome the cheapness of these UAVs and so forth, of these munitions, in that sense, right? The reliance of mass to just overcome the amount of cheap missiles, cheap platforms that can be directed towards them. It's more about the reintroducing the division level. Not so much about that. At least I don't see it. It's more about operating at a division level is something that I have lost for the longest time, and seeing it as a counter, or seeing it as a need in the great powers competition that is supposed to be coming between China and Russia and so forth, right? It's not so much about, I don't think it's so much about the ability to counter cheap weapon systems, right? That is where they're leaning heavily into the autonomous type systems, the AI type systems to counter that threat. They're leaning more into the technology side than the mass side to counter that threat.
The most interesting development revealed to us by the Ukrainian war is actually the EW capabilities of the Russian military.
Yes.
Originally, it had been the case that American combat power was obviously, okay, just to give you background, legionaries out there. The idea is that the United States really heavily emphasized on a technological edge from the 1970s period onward to counter the overwhelming mass of the Soviet Union, and focusing on striking, deep strikes into the enemy logistic rear. Now, of course, our enemy gets a vote, right? And so, of course, they were working furiously to counter our technological edges. And among them is, of course, scrambling targeting systems that a lot of these weapons platforms that the United States military utilizes. And of course, one of the things that we discovered ourselves is the capacity for the U.S. For the Russian military to veer off course or to hack JDAMs off target successfully
Yeah.
at roughly a rate of 70% at first. It's become more efficacious as time has gone on, but it still remains a significant challenge to combat power, if that makes sense, and especially because of the fact that our doctrine revolves very strongly on surgical precision munitions. I think that's something that really is understated, right? I mean, am I wrong?
I think to be better put is doctrine relies on having absolute air superiority.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So perfect. And I guess, I wanted to pick your brain. Can you tell us about the Russians' EW capabilities? What do we expect, and what is it that blew our socks off and kind of changed our estimation of the Russian threat?
So I know a few things, but sadly I can't really put them out on this on this medium. Yeah. But spending time. So when I was in doing some operations in Germany, I was on mobilization in Germany and given several briefs by higher echelon intelligence assets. It was rather eye-opening and shocking to see the abilities that at the time, even this was before. Again, Russia was in the Donbass, but it had not, and Crimea, but it had not gone fully into or further into Ukraine. But learning the capabilities they had of where we were stationed or where we were conducting operations or training in Poland, being told, the Russians essentially can hear you, right? And you're just and you're like, what the hell is going on?
Are you serious?
And yeah. By hear us, I mean not like by hear us, I mean intercept our comms and signals and such. Even at the distance that we were. Mm-hmm. Certain platforms out there and all that. And it's because the U.S. military has relied on technology for so long in a way to minimize the threat, minimize the threat to the individual, service member, soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine, right? Mm-hmm. Perform surgical strikes, hit them with drones, rather than actually putting, people on target, right? Unless they're, SF or such. Mm-hmm. And while great in many ways, because it keeps you alive and so forth, and and great in the sense that in a uncontested in an uncontested airspace, it works perfectly. Mm-hmm. But that over reliance has kind of dulled the senses of the American people and the Pentagon and so forth to the fact that in warfare people die. It just happens. I'm sorry, it just does, and it's sad. And I'm glad I didn't die when I was in Iraq and other locations, but people do, and it's sad. And it's a part of warfare. Like you can try to make warfare as clean as possible, but it's not. There's only so far you can go. Mm-hmm. In a way, the Pentagon went too far. The DoD went too far, or the U.S. government went too far. The over reliance on bombing locations, the air campaign in the 91 Gulf War, the 03 invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. Try to make this kind of bloodless war. Mm-hmm. Doing so, it's really atrophied the skills of, I can only speak really of, the military, of the U.S. Army, of, the individual soldier. You give an individual soldier a map and a compass, and they have no idea where they're doing, where they're going, and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. They've been so reliant on GPS, everything from their phone to even, daggers that they would have in Afghanistan. And so what happens when that gets turned off, right? What happens when GPS goes down? What happens when the generators go down? What happens when you hit, you get, an EW, something with EW affects your ability to perform combat operations. Mm-hmm. How well has it been trained for operations to continue? And again, that's just something that's atrophied within the U.S. Army.
Technology fails, precisely.
Yeah, it does. technology fails, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that has been my biggest gripe in the last 5 to 7 years, looking at how the U.S. Army has adopted certain transitions, going very high tech when I believe, well, maybe you should go also low tech in certain ways,
Mm-hmm.
and they just have.
It seems to be.
And
Go ahead.
oh, so and low tech is low tech isn't always the answer. High tech isn't always the answer. It's always the right mix because it depends on the attributes of the specific war that you're fighting. But it's more of if you step back, right? It's more about how there is a lack of imagination, a lack of research, a lack of allowing different viewpoints or dissonant viewpoints into the decision making process. And I think that is really the issue. That's really the crux of what's going on within a lot of the decision making within, say, the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but agree with you, and I'm really glad that you've been, and especially you're somebody that is of far superior qualifications than I do, as a combat veteran and
Thank you.
a dude that actually knows the fuck he's talking about. However, it's something I
know how to use Wikipedia, and I know how to use and read doctrine. That's about it.
Good to go. No.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I think, how do I say this? The challenge of every military since the dawn of time, because of the natural, innate quality of the culture of a martial culture, gives it leans towards conservatism in the sense it doesn't like dissenting opinions. If it does change, it changes in a very prescribed way, top down, as I'm sure you noticed. And of course, although I think I want to applaud specifically the Army for providing a forum for military experts and military adjacent individuals to provide maybe pitch ideas and so on to innovate military thinking beyond the scope of the big Army itself. However, I completely agree with you, and you see this in the combat operations of people of, for instance, the Russian Federation, as I alluded to before, in the Chechen wars, and later in Georgia, and of course later on in the early Ukrainian war, and then finally now. We are starting to see that, it's just as you say, technology isn't the ace in the hole. It's an important edge, but our enemies are just as good. And ultimately, we need a lot of durable equipment readily available. And just as people are talking about, there's this famous maxim, amateurs talk about tactics and masters talk about logistics. One of the most pressing concerns that have been revealed to us in this conflict, like I said, in mass, is the lack of safe industrial base or military industrial complex in the United States that's secured in a chain that can actually provide logistical support to any potential large-scale military operations. And that is a glaring shortcoming of ours, which of course is due to the 90s and globalization and the end of the Cold War. And we're seeing that ultimately a country that has a real industrial base is the one that will win at the end of the day. I wanted to ask you your opinion on the primacy of addressing that issue and what you suggest and what could possibly we do to fix that shortcoming.
So to kind of go back to what you were saying at the very beginning, right? With technology, durable, low tech, and all that, right? Honestly, none of that matters if you do not have a coherent strategy on how to use those effectively in a means to accomplish your mission. So you can have all the missiles in the world, you can have all the Tomahawks, you're going to have 11 aircraft carriers, but if you don't have a strategy that is coherent, that has set criteria for mission success, it really doesn't mean anything, right? So I mean, I just want to kind of point that out is again, we've relied so much on our having the mostest, having the bestest, and so forth. But then when we go into operations with kind of this kind of fuzzy idea of what we're going to do, bad things happen, innocent people die, and soldiers come home draped in American flag coffins, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, that is that's a part of what needs to be addressed is, fixing how strategy flows down to the operational level, down to the tactical level, and almost a reintroduction of what strategy is that has been lost, since the Cold War and since we no longer have this kind of life or death enemy, it being the Soviet Union, and that kind of dovetails into my somewhat of a hobby of researching the rise and fall and death of what is called strategic intelligence. Mm-hmm. So that's just kind of like my little pet project I have.
Can you explain? Can you explain that? Actually, I'm not aware of this. What is that? I'm not even aware of it as a category in and of itself. So if you could just tell us.
Are you speaking of like strategic intelligence?
That's right.
Okay, so there are echelons when it comes to war fighting, right? So you have the tactical level, which is essentially where the bullets are flying, soldiers are in the trenches and so forth. Operational is the next step higher, where instead of directing individual, say, units of a battalion or so, brigade, you're getting more, say,
you're on the campaign
brigade
level.
Kind of campaign level. You're looking at larger swaths of countries and so forth. Sometimes maybe entire nations and so forth. And strategy, right, is at the QCOM, CENTCOM, national, global type of perspective, right? It's the overarching. It's the overarching vision. There's different ways you can put it, but like this overarching vision of how the war should be fought and what it's being fought for, essentially. In the terms of strategic intelligence, it follows the same, right? You have tactical intelligence, which is I just grab this insurgent off the off the field, and he gave me this information and so forth. So that's tactical level, operations at the next level, and then strategic is kind of is at that same level of COCOM and at national kind of level of operations. And strategic intelligence has been kind of given this idea that it's a timeline, like it's over the horizon type thing, but it's also about fulfilling the needs of what the strategic level decision making needs to be. And that doesn't necessarily isn't bound by a time, a long time. It could be a year, right? A strategic type of objective could still be within a year, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
And so strategic intelligence has always been this ability to see things at a larger scale rather than seeing the larger players, how they interact, versus as the U.S. Army has become accustomed to, more at the tactical level of getting the surgeon the next day, right? The intel cycle of combat operations down at the battalion, brigade level, running against insurgents, right? Pop, getting those insurgents, off the streets, getting the IEDs off the roads and so forth.
Correctly, it's effectively perceiving the political end state brought on of the war, basically, like elucidating the goals of the end state.
But then,
right?
But so strategic intelligence is what is fed to the decision makers, Congress and president and so forth. That it's just more than just about what's going on tactically at the ground level. It's about, hey, this is what could be 3-5 years down the road. This is what we see, emerging threats, so forth, blah blah blah, right? Mm-hmm. And we just kind of lost that, right? We just have. Mm-hmm. It's rather atrophied, and there has been some effort to reintroduce it. There's been several books written. There's a lot of articles written in the 90s about it, because that was when a lot of the major players of the Cold War began to see the I guess you say de-evolution of it, at the CIA and other sites, just three-letter agencies, and they started to ring the bell, but it didn't work.
The greatest issue, I think, is that there is no unity of political command in the United States. As you can see, like the decision-making imperative is not set by any one sovereign, so there isn't like this cogent.
I'm sorry. What do you mean by that? Sorry.
So, like, imperatives are, especially like, for instance, in Afghanistan, I think is the most famous example of mission creep in our most recent history.
Okay.
And the reason being is because the executive authority had to balance the interests of various different organs within the United States government, instead of course, these organs meeting the demands of the political sovereign, the actor. Like, so in this case, of course, the commander-in-chief, which is the president. So instead, the American model is deferring to departments for their own specific strategic interests, or rather, its strategic imperatives it's given itself. And what ends up happening, of course, is that none of these individual departments can achieve their stated end state without, of course, imposing shortcomings or vulnerabilities or destabilization of someone else's end state. And we saw that in Afghanistan. I'm sure you probably fucking remember.
Yeah.
Let's say like the DIA very much focused on the I think it's the Al-Haqqani, or I forgot what it was called, but the Pakistani.
The Haqqani network and the Eastern Afghanistan. Haqqani.
Yeah. And then of course there were State Department imperatives of women's rights and so on. And then of course there's the myriad different presidencies and their cabinets and their interests, and of course the military-industrial complex and their interests, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And I don't want to bother you, but I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, I feel like the reason why we lack that strategic insight, or that will to have a clear, defined goal like the one we had in 1991 Desert Storm, is because ultimately the presidency has lost its unity of command and vision, and therefore cannot dictate solid parameters for any one stated war goal. Would you agree with that?
I'm going to push back a little bit in the notion that
go for it.
The president does issue out national security guidance and strategy, I think on a biannually basis. Every 2 years it comes out. And so, that is the framework of how the government, all the agencies, departments, and so forth, are going to. That is what they're working towards, right? The strategy, the national security strategy that comes out, right? The problem is not so much that the president doesn't have necessarily control over those agencies and departments. It's more of, the way I see it is that there isn't a single or a singular point of threat that could be it all can be directed towards. Does that make sense? Through the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union, right? And so everyone was on that mission set. Everyone was on the same sheet of music, right?
It's about calibrating on a common target, right? A common definable target. Okay.
Yeah. And then when the Cold War was over, going before GWOT, I mean, it was literally like schizophrenia, right? I mean, it was in the sense that you had departments and missions and all this kind of stuff, like, in search of, new avenues to make themselves relevant. And also with this comes the rise of all the social issues, social justice-ish stuff that comes up, right? And that starts creeping into the narrative about the same time. And so then when GWOT hits, it's as I call it, it becomes, warfare ADHD. There is no single point of focus, right? How do you defeat if it is a global war on terrorism? Terrorism is a tactic. So how do you defeat a tactic, right? Because of that, and that being relatively ill-defined through many and several national security strategies, it gives a lot of leeway for all these departments to kind of do whatever the hell they want, right? To address that issue, and that's why in Afghanistan you had, this, gender rights type of initiative by the Department of State and so forth, right? And so I think it's more that case versus then the president or the executive branch just not having control. It's just this lack of a singular focus of threats. And then one can say, the whole notion of deep state continuing on with their mission sets, and the Trump administration and certain departments, and just outright ignored what he said. So,
yeah, that was actually, honestly, I was impressed, the ballsiness of it, just the flagrant. It's just.
Oh yeah, I mean, hey, DOD, Pentagon, I want you out of Syria now. Nah, we're just not going to do it.
We're good.
We're good. But again, I will say this. They tried to pull the same shit with Biden, right? And I give Biden credit. Like he stood firm. And again, I think if I'm not making any statements about the 2020 election. If Trump was president now, or at the time during the drawdown or during the withdrawal, he would have stuck to the guns as well. But part of the issues that arose out of the withdrawal of Afghanistan was the DOD dragging its feet. It really, in the Pentagon, just dragging its feet, saying that, oh, we're never going to leave, so therefore we're just not going to plan have any type of contingency plan. Or any type of well thought out contingency plan. That's how. That's my belief.
I've come to a similar perception of things. Like I think you're right on target. Honestly, I think you're over target right now, because ultimately, the nature of bureaucracy, and especially when you get into intelligence with compartmentalization, which a lot of you guys don't know. Basically, you can have security clearance, but it's also need to know basis. So there's a vector which bisects, people's basically mental horizon. It limits them. And so ultimately, what we have is basically a bunch of individuals in offices coming to conclusions based on incomplete pictures, and there is always chaos, and it's parcel of the reason why the surge of 2007 kind of failed in Iraq, unfortunately. And I guess the one thing that I think the United States, and since I'm a private citizen, I can say this, I would say that I think when America was better at waging war when it was waging it under Henry Kissinger, because we make too many of these mistakes where we go abroad and we occupy a country, and then we start doing this thing which is a big no-no. Ever since, read Machiavelli the Prince, you have to respect the customs of the local place that you're in. And ultimately, we made that massive mistake in Iraq, and especially in Afghanistan, where we are sending people who are antithetical to their convictions, as odious as we may perceive them to be. It is important as warfighters to be, let's say, Romans in Rome, if that makes sense. Because what's going to end up happening is exactly what ended up happening with the Soviets, and it happened with us, which is we estranged the population we're trying to win over, or at least get their acquiescence, if not their outright support, because of the fact that we're pushing things that really kind of rub them the wrong way. And in fact, many of the State Department initiatives rub regular Americans the wrong way. And I believe returning to a mode of war where the military imperatives reign as paramount instead of the social imperatives or anything else downstream, I think that would be a good way of actually waging and conducting warfare. I mean, would you agree with that?
So I kind of have two parts of that. Is you bring up Kissinger, and it's I there needs to be a reintroduction into the conversation of in our national security conversation, how we use the military, in of the recognition of the very clearly stated, very clearly delineated interests of what we would consider near peer adversaries, great powers, and so forth, and even middle tier nations, right? Like we have like the recognition of, okay, this is your this is country X's geopolitical interests. This is what they want, so forth, right? Mm-hmm. And giving it giving it validity. We don't necessarily agree with it, right? But then when when their interests very much compete with ours, or create a threatening situation for us, which again, we must be very clear about what our stated national security interests are. Then that's when you really start to introduce military force, diplomacy by other means, and so forth. And we just don't do that, right? Like we just kind of like that,
The greatest example is, of course, Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait, and having conversed with the U.S. ambassador, effectively asking for permission, asking if the United States would react to such an aggression. And I think, like, in the most understated, most wrong way of portraying ourselves, the ambassador basically told Saddam Hussein that we wouldn't care. And of course, we didn't really care. And I completely agree with you. Just to serve as an example to what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's you're. Well, the problem with that was like, because Iraq still had a very large army, no matter how what state it was in. It was more about threatening Saudi Arabia. That was really what people were like. That's really what got the U.S. government all freaked out, right? It wasn't them invading Kuwait. It was the weakness, the military weakness and vulnerability to Saudi Arabia. Really, that's what it boiled down to.
Because what I understand at the time, the majority of the oil was coming from that region specifically, and the oil fields were just over the border from Kuwait, right? Is that how it was?
Yeah. Well, it's not only that, but also like the destabilization of the Saudi government, right? So, the Saudi government, while very, pro-Western, caveat of how much money got flowed into the coffers of Al Qaeda / 9/11. Anyway, the Saudi government is pro-Western, it's pro-America. The people, maybe not so much, right? Because because of cultural reasons, right?
Right, of course.
And so, what they didn't want was some sort of invasion, or making the government at the time seem weak, and then that causing a whole host of issues, right? Mm-hmm. So, but again, going back to the recognition of other nations' kind of vested geopolitical or national security interests, right? The U.S. has a long history of just kind of like overlooking that, we do, it's very much of what we do is okay. If you do it, it's not. And just kind of dismissing the desires of other nations and what they want to do. Now, granted, sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. Sometimes again, certain nations need to be pushed back against. But again, when you just ignore, or you make a nation who has a very long history of being very proud of who they are seem less, or make them view themselves as less, it's just a recipe for disaster, right? And you can kind of see what's going on with Russia with today.
Precisely, and it is really.
And again, let me just caveat this: I do not condone Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think it's wrong. You shouldn't invade other nations under false pretense. So there you go.
Well, of course, and like I said before, we're examining things from an indifferent perspective. You know, we don't have a dog in this fight. You know, and I guess just to kind of bring it full circle here, and we're talking about the intangible with the tangible, the kinetic with the political, and I guess the perfect crossover between information warfare and political dialogue was with the Putin Carlson interview. And I guess I just wanted to first.
Which I'm going to confess, I have not watched.
Oh, okay.
I have not watched at all.
Okay.
No. And the reason I haven't watched is one, I guess I just really haven't found the time. I've been kind of busy, and two, I really didn't see it as like me learning anything from it. What I really was interested in, and really what I had focused on in that interview, was people's reaction to it. That to me is the story. So sorry, go ahead.
So I mean, for those of you that don't know, right now I believe Russia is the most embargoed country in the world, economically speaking, more than the DPRK, North Korea, which is
very interesting, right?
Very interesting, and obviously it seems that our economic forecasts for their country are vastly underestimating its actual economic potency and its ability to circumnavigate our embargoes. It seems that they have more friends than we expected, or at least the liberal clique in government.
Well, I wouldn't call them. Wouldn't call them friends. I would say people with similar interests. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say India and Russia are friends, but they have similar interests.
Partners. How about that? Maybe
partners. Yeah, there you go.
Fair weather friends. Maybe, I don't know. But but I guess the main controversy is that people are calling for Tucker Carlson, an American citizen, to be detained upon visiting the United States, his home country, for interviewing a, I guess, hostile power. But although we're in we're at peace, diplomatic peace with Russia.
We are not at war. We are not at war with Russia. Yes,
exactly. And
are we? Are we?
I guess so. I mean, maybe maybe not. But I guess it begs the question, though, because in this age, it's globalized age of information. You know, information warfare is itself just as dangerous and just as deadly as, you know, a man with a gun in a trench on the Ukrainian front. As we can see, it can really affect morale, and it really can undermine the support Ukraine might receive, and I think that's what I heard as well from the pro-Ukrainian side. And then, of course, there's the American principle side, which is he's an American citizen exercising freedom of speech, and that ultimately the only thing more corrosive to our American Republic dying than invasion is our dereliction of our freedoms, which is freedom of speech itself, and our lack of ability to champion it. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, what are the military implications of this kind of dialogue? And then second of all, what are the internal... Well, actually, I can't ask you political questions. How about I ask you...
Well, you can. I mean, ask me a question, and I can see if I can answer it or not.
Okay, yeah. I guess I would be asking you, what does American freedom mean in a world where even speech is considered a weapon of the enemy?
And are we in that? I mean, you mean like now? I mean, last 20 years. I mean, I mean, don't forget you had the Sedition Act that Wilson used to put Debs in jail, right?
Alien Sedition Act, 1917.
Alien, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of old as time. Again, you know, Lincoln did it, you know, with newspapers and such. And so, okay, so, so, you know, not only have people called for his detention, I mean, people have called for him to be, you know, arrested for treason, right? And, you know, again, when you ask them, you know, well, what do you do with traitors, right? You know, they seem to kind of glaze over, right? Like you kill traitors, right? That's
well,
their,
they know very well what they're taught, what they're saying. They know.
But they will not verbalize that, right? They say, well, no, he needs to be arrested for treason. But then when you ask them, okay, well, then what does that mean? Again, they kind of glaze over, right? And so, meaning that they're cowards. And you know, again, the reason I really wasn't interested in watching it, like, it's not going to necessarily change hearts and minds of the people who either like Tucker or don't like him and all that. It's more about, how do people within the media and the government react to it, right? You bring up all the interviews that Barbara Walters conducted through her career with all the, some of the worst elements and the dictators and authoritarian leaders of nations. And again, there's no real response. They say it's different this time. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
they don't tell you why, though, because it's about
it's just different.
It's about democracy and my decency. Okay.
It's always about the real journalists who are in Russia, they're in jail, right? Mm-hmm. The real Americans are in jail. And I'm like, okay. I mean, again, how does that apply to the situation? It's born out of just this kind of blind hatred of Tucker in the first place and everything he kind of stands for and does and says and so forth. And then it's this kind of knee-jerk reaction of Putin is Hitler. The whole, have you heard of, I came across this a little while ago, and I found this to be very interesting, but the whole concept of, Schrodinger's cat, right?
Yeah.
You know that concept? Okay.
Yeah.
So but it's being applied to the Russian military, right? So either, it's either the most strongest thing in the world and it's going to overtake NATO, but at the same time, it can't, take over Ukraine, right? So it can't be true. Both
for the audience, Schrodinger's cat is a concept where it's both a thing is both is and isn't, and is both things at once until it's verified, which means basically what Pete is saying, Mr. Wrangel is saying, is that people are saying for 3 years now that Russia is both on the edge of collapse and also on the precipice of invading France. Mm-hmm. And it's Schrodinger's Russia.
Yeah. I mean, how many articles have you read throughout the last several years? So we're leading up on the second anniversary of the invasion. How many articles have you read where Russia was literally scraping the bottom of the barrel of their missiles? Right.
Right. Innumerable.
Yeah.
Or
and
that
again,
Putin was dying from Alzheimer's or something.
Yeah. And to me, that, like, I hate that. Again, Russia shouldn't invade Ukraine, but again, I hate that because it just illustrates piss poor intelligence analysis, right? And coming from someone who takes that who's done that as a profession, like, it's just, I hate it. I hate seeing piss poor intelligence analysis passed along as truth, right? Mm-hmm. Passed along by all these military talking heads, whom, if you control F their names in the Afghanistan papers, they proliferate. They proliferate those reports.
That is a major concern. I'm glad that you touched on that. That military mm-hmm. leaders and high-ranking officials have a rather incestuous information gathering source by outsourcing their information to these newspaper and social media sites, mm-hmm. Classical media sites,
or I think it's worse when you have, like, they outsource it to think tanks, right? Like, think tanks that obviously have an agenda, mm-hmm. And then you look at who's on the board of directors of them, and you're just like, oh, look, the person who totally failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're all the board of directors. Okay, this makes sense.
The most interesting thing is, it's like, of course, when you're fighting Putin, and of course the legacy of the ex-Soviet state is that there are a number of different mm-hmm. oligarchs and rich men, powerful men, mm-hmm. who have emigrated or been expatriated from Russia under threat of violence from Putin, obviously, mm-hmm. And basically have a bone to pick. And for instance, one of the mm-hmm. most prevalent ones is Garry Kasparov, who was this ex-chess grandmaster, if I remember correctly, and a political opponent of Putin who had to escape. He's a rich guy, and he basically subsidized some classic media sources and pulls influence mm-hmm. in furtherance of his personal vendetta against Russia. Because it's very interesting from an objective point of view. The United States government has nothing to fear from the Russian government, and like, a lot of Russian people are going to be pissed at me, but it's a fucking regional power. It's a pushover. If we decided to
What?
actually balls to the wall attack or to interdict the Russians in Ukraine, I believe that obviously we'd be pretty bloodied. I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I'm definitely certain that we'd push their shit in after a while. And I think that
I mean, I agree. I agree with that to a certain extent. Like, yes, we could, yes, we could cause a lot of damage to them, but then in return, our military would be very decimated in the sense of of its combat strength. So again, yeah.
Right, and like I said, we wouldn't get. It's not like we wouldn't get our hair mussed. It would definitely. It would be a dog fight. But what I'm trying to explicate to the viewer who doesn't know these things is that in the mind of the boomer, Russia is the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is unstoppable, and it has the same prerogatives and initiatives that the Soviet state had with its Marxist indoctrination. And
the reason I laugh, I'm sorry, is how interchangeable people use Russia and the Soviet Union, in tweets and stuff like that, or trying to get a message out. And it's just a pet peeve of mine, because it just demonstrates how one, illiterate they are, and two, how obvious what the point they're trying, the propaganda they're trying to push out.
And moreover, I think it's important it's causing us to misunderstand who Putin is. People believe Putin to be Stalin, when in reality, Putin was actually...
exactly. No. They view even worse. No. They view him as Hitler. That's
right, exactly.
They don't even view him as Stalin, right? Because remember, Stalin is never used an example when it comes to the mass killing of people.
Of course,
right?
Yes.
So Hitler. So yeah.
No, but I guess my greater point that I'm trying to make, and for those of you who want to be informed, it was actually during the beginning of Putin's political career in the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He was actually part of the faction fighting against the generals who were trying to do a coup in 1991 to restore the Soviet Union from crumbling. Mm-hmm. So this guy is actually, and the thing is that people don't understand, both on the left and the right, is that Putin is not... He's not lebased, whatever. He's a Machiavellian individual with classical liberal maybe predilections. He believe. I think he is a liberal. I mean, he has every opportunity to. I mean, if he wanted to reform Russia into the Soviet Union again, if he wanted to, because he has that kind of power, or if he wanted to, he could. I don't know. He could just become a freaking czar, or a dictator. But at the end of the day, I think he genuinely is just a strong man, Lee Kuan Yew parallel,
he's someone who seeks power and will do such and will take on whatever means necessary to get power, right?
Precisely.
He isn't he isn't this and people who view him as such is kind of disturbing, as this alt-right, right-wing type of thing where preserving Orthodox Christianity and all kind of stuff no, that's just not true. That's just not happening. Just don't.
Or he's a Soviet man because he's pushing,
he was in the KGB. Oh, okay. Do you realize that H.W. Bush was the head of the CIA? I mean, come on, man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And moreover, I think it should call to attention the reason why there are myriad misconceptions of Russia and Putin is because Putin and Russia are all things to all people. And they do, the intelligence services, specifically the GRU and others, have a express purpose of doing that, to both, to both put the best case scenario, friendly scenario to different demographic populations, to make them more friendly to Russia, but also to portray themselves in a favorable light, depending on who's doing. And that is one of the scariest things about 5G warfare, is that they're able to affect an algorithm which represents their country in a favorable light, dependent on your personal predilections. And there are which is crazy.
Exactly.
Which is crazy. But I guess go ahead. I
was gonna say, kind of, for me, taking a step back a little bit, it goes back to the kind of the dearth or the death of strategic intelligence, right? This greater and broader view of a situation, understanding how things came to be and why they are. understanding, the background that gave rise to Putin, what Putin did in his first several years against the insurgency in Chechnya, and so forth, right? And so, and why people kind of, and understanding, what gave rise to him and what people kind of view him as, and, for whatever, you can say, faulty elections and so forth, but like, continuing to get elected with really no real major like pushback or protests. Yes, there are protests, but they're not like, streaming, into the streets and such all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And so, understanding the greater background to situations, whether it be in, what's going on in Russia, understanding what's going on in Venezuela, understanding, the intricacies going on in Africa, wherever, right? Like understanding all this stuff, and does not happen in a vacuum, right? History did not begin in 1945, right? History didn't begin in 2001. There are bigger trends in play, and people don't see it, nor do they want to, because again, people just don't see strategic intelligence, or they don't use strategic intelligence in the government anymore.
I'm really glad that you say that, and I hope you don't mind me ranting for a little bit just to actually explicate your point. If you are a military leader and any political leader in general, do not be a peasant who perceives his enemy as good or evil. They're just adversaries, and ultimately all political dynamics come down to power. Putin is not he's not my friend, and he's not like the demiurge. He's not the Antichrist. Mm-hmm. He is a dude who will stomp on your dick if he can to get his way, if you let him.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I believe that there's this American mistake of conflating morals with political analysis, and that ultimately, when in regards to Russia, like, of course, Russia is an adversary of the United States. It is adversarial. Mm-hmm. It is trying to maximize its power. It's called power maximization, right? However, the art of diplomacy and understanding our strategic interests is to know when to fight, when to not, when to really go out on a limb and limit someone. And I think that's something that you see on both sides of the political spectrum, an absence of, and especially most alarmingly in the military elite, which I believe, compared to anyone else in American society, should be the most responsible and the most sober-minded about these things. Otherwise, we're going to get fucked. But I mean, that's
I'm sorry, going to.
Yeah, I know, right? It's really unfortunate, but I would like to last point that I would like to, I'd like to make.
Well, before you get to your last point, I just want to hit on that. Not seeing your enemies as good or bad, good, evil, and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. It also leads into do not underestimate your enemy, right? Do not dehumanize them in a sense of, as we did, during the GWAT, sandal wearing goat fuckers and such,
right?
Because what that does is again, you underestimate their capabilities, right? Yes, they don't have the same capabilities as you, but they have other capabilities that you don't. And so once you start to do that, then you're just leading into a thought process, into a loop of your OODA loop, how you process things becomes very skewed. You miss things, and next thing you know, you're being driven out of Afghanistan and Iraq and other locations. Precisely. And that's a problem I see within government military hierarchy, and in the private sector as well too. Mm-hmm. And so just don't underestimate your enemy. Never do. I don't think Russia is the greatest thing ever. Obviously because they operated in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They have a lot of doctrinal issues, and they had a lot of issues operationally. But at the same time, I'm not going to say that we could just take whatever our handful, maybe brigade division issues in what we have in Europe and make it into Moscow within a month. I'm just not going to say that, right?
Right, of course.
But people have. So that's the point I wanted to make.
And the interesting history between us and Russia is actually pretty long. And this is the point
Mhm.
that I wanted to make is that based on context, we are friendly and enemies dependent on the political dynamic. So,
Mhm.
for those of you
Yeah.
that don't know, John Paul Jones, the founder of the United States Navy, was actually after the Revolutionary War commissioned by the Imperial Russian Navy to fight for them and train for them, train them, etc. And then later, of course, during the Civil War, the United States government asked the Russian Baltic Fleet to weigh anchor to in NYC Port Harbor, right, as a deterrent against possible British intervention, and especially because the Union Navy was busy blockading the South and the clipper
Yep.
ships,
Hmm.
etc., and the threat, of course, of invasion from the South by the French and a combined British force. And then later,
Hmm.
of course, during the First World War, we were allies. And in the immediate aftermath, when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, we sent a division of men
Yep.
to
Yes, we did.
fight the communists in the Polar Bear Expedition. And it was
Hmm.
only when Russia became a Bolshevik state, a communist state, that we became true enemies. And especially after World War II, where
Hmm.
they became our only peer adversary. The aftermath, the issue with olds being in the government is that they are
So,
function.
I I just want to kind of continue on that, right?
Go ahead.
It, you know, I, I have no illusion, nor should others have any illusion that after the wall fell, NATO expanded, and this whole idea that Russia can be incorporated into NATO or into some sort of mutual agreement, like that just was not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it is noted that Putin was the first head of a state to call Bush after 9/11 to provide assistance, and it is his and with his I guess with his like assistance was able to open up the air bases and the stands that allowed for the initial operations and for several years operations into Afghanistan.
Oh,
Um,
I didn't know that.
and that yeah and that Russia being more kind of Putin and Russia being more of a kind of like tit for tat, I do something for you, you do something for me type of mindset. When they didn't see the reciprocal nature, things started to get cold.
Of course.
Again, I'm not saying right or wrong, but I'm just saying is that we have a very complicated history with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
That and again 9/11, Russia was still had a low intensity insurgency in Chechnya, also in this very odd place called Dagestan, who certain people who was a Navy SEAL had no idea existed. Whatever. So there were some mutual interests that could have been capitalized on, but again, there was never going to be any type of grand alliance, NATO incorporation, and so forth.
Of course.
It's also proven that the intelligence apparatus within Russia were notified the FBI on 2 different occasions about the Boston bombers, and those were essentially ignored.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, those are just data points. They don't necessarily mean anything. Just the fact that we have a very complicated history with Russia.
Yeah, and I think this stems from, of course, this animosity stems from, how to say this in a diplomatic way, a certain clique who has a disproportionate amount of power in our government that are expatriates of that, country, if that makes sense. And they have a bone to pick, and ultimately they make our interest in waging war against them, one and the same with theirs. And so I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and especially there are a lot of misconceptions with Cold War Gen X, boomer types who, for whatever reason, I think it's maybe an age thing where like after a certain age, you kind of like are incapable of having the brain plasticity to understand that the circumstances have shifted.
Yeah. It's very interesting when I talk to my mother. Yes.
That is the I mean
Yeah.
and the worst thing, I think the worst thing is that we're focusing all this energy on Russia when we have to focus on the enemy within the gates, which is the PRC, and
Yeah.
which is the most incredible threat we are facing currently. I mean, I
Mhm.
remember when the Russians deployed their hypersonic missile in the first strike in Ukraine last year, and we thought that was some kind of exceptional deployment, and especially because we couldn't track it on our radar air defense battery for the Patriot missile battery or
Mhm.
something. Um, but the most concerning thing is that the country with the most advanced ballistic missile technology is itself the PRC. And
Mhm.
on top of everything
Dude,
else, they've been massively upgrading. And I guess I just wanted to pick your brain. I mean, like, shouldn't we be focusing on the PRC instead?
I've lost count on how many official pivots to Asia or the Pacific that the multiple administrations have tried to initiate. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yes, the PRC. More information is kind of trickling out. The PRC does have some systemic and structural issues that we may not have been tracking correctly. But that doesn't mean that they're not a threat, and that doesn't mean that, um, and that doesn't mean that China or the PRC does not have the will as a culture and as a government to address those issues in a very in a manner that would be almost foreign to the West.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, if you were to, yeah, I would see the PRC as a threat, because of its not again military and all such, but also the stranglehold that it has, and on manufacturing and all these different issues. Yeah, the PRC is a greater strategic threat than Russia now and going into the future. Yes.
I think the most amazing document to have come out of the PLA is this book called Unrestricted Warfare, which lays out in no uncertain terms the PRC's modus operandi of how to achieve political ends. And again,
Mm-hmm.
China is a highly centralized and unified country, and so they're able to do things which I'm about to explain here, which is unrestricted warfare is the idea that war is not just the kinetic aspect of military forces engaging with other military forces to occupy physical territory. It is the simultaneous deployment of intelligence capabilities, economic capabilities, and paramilitary capabilities, as well as things such as information and political influence in rival countries. So I'm getting this information from Brigadier General. I think it's shoot. It's escaping my mind, but the name of the book is Unrestricted Warfare, or excuse me,
Mm-hmm.
Stealth War. And basically, he enumerates in no uncertain terms how much land the PRC is buying in the United States, which is arable land,
Mm-hmm.
and being diverted its
Mm-hmm.
productivity to China. How many politicians, and I know this is not your opinion, but this is my own, and it doesn't reflect on you,
Mm-hmm.
but politicians that are in the pocket of PRC oligarchs. For instance,
Mitch
Senator
McConnell.
Mitch McConnell is married to the daughter of a major
Mm-hmm.
PRC party member and an oligarch,
Mm-hmm.
and on top of everything else, of course, of the 5G network in the United States is actually in large part owned by Chinese multinationals. TikTok, of course, is one of the most
Yep.
famous examples. And this slow creep, this slow dissolution of any defenses we may have domestically are quietly being acquired by inconspicuous individuals in furtherance of political objectives, right? So, for instance, Taiwan. Many people believe that, I know this for a fact, for the last 10 years, the Americans believed that the PRC was on the verge of invading into Taiwan and seizing it forcefully. I mean, why would they
Yeah.
when they just have to wait out the United States and slowly put pressure on the United States to finally concede or, how do you say, loosen its protective guarantees on the Taiwanese government And they have already done that. The United States government has already shifted a number of factories, strategically important, vital factories, back to the United States from Taiwan, as well as being less vocal in the support of its integrity. Until, of course, the most recent bill, which allocated certain amount of billions to their defense. So, I mean,
Hmm.
like, I think the future of warfare is precisely that deep battle concept of
Yeah.
multi-domain, multi-pronged acquisition of political ends. I mean, have you read this book, by the way, Unrestricted
Well,
Warfare?
I haven't, but also long term, right? So long term initiatives, not necessarily, you know what I'm saying? Like, not, but long term initiatives that are also very consistent no matter who's in charge, in the PRC. So
Exactly.
that's something that's kind of that I miss. So no, I haven't read the book yet. Actually, I need to. If you can send me the link or the name of it, I'd appreciate it. So I kind of want to make 2 points about that. Is, one, again, the PRC is, they're having some issues when it comes to, they're having actually serious issues, with their demographics. They're aging a little bit faster than we had initially assessed. The replacement rate, birth rate isn't as high again as we had initially believed it to be, and so maybe not their ability kind of to wait out the West in a sense isn't as long as as one kind of believes.
I see.
But because of the one child policy, there are, I think, about 200 million males in China that, because of the economy, don't really have very bright economic futures or security, and also because of the gender imbalance, have zero have zero
Marriage
chances of
prospects.
finding
Yeah. Yeah.
a marriage prospects, right? So you have 200 million essentially, military aged men, right? Because if you look at, the timeline and such of the one child policy, and what is the PRC going to do with them, right? Because 200 million military aged men, that can be very dangerous within your borders, right? No matter what, whatever ideology they support. So the PRC probably, is a tool, right? Those 200 million military aged men are a tool. I see them as a tool that the PRC will use. Uh,
Hey, gentlemen. We cut it off there because it ran a little bit too long. However, this will come in a second part. So, Legionaries, be aware for the next transmission. But until next time, this is Lance's Legion. This is General Lance and Sergeant Barnes, joined with you by General Wrangel. Signing off until next time.